We will try it one more time. 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, good morning, 5W class, and welcome back. If you decided to join us again today, just want to say in advance thank you. We've got a really excellent lesson. We're moving on from the book of Judges last week to the book of Ruth this week, and it's a wonderful story with a lot of very positive and upbeat outcome, unlike some of the stories in the book of Judges. As we always do, whenever we start a brand new book in the 5Ws class, we spend some time trying to emphasize the who, where, when, what, and why. And so we'll do that this morning. I'll have some introductory slides to give you just in a second. I try not to spend too much time on that, but it'll give you something to look at after class if you need to come back and study some of the details. Ruth is a short book of only 4 chapters, and what makes Ruth interesting among many other things is the fact that in the book of Matthew, let's jump in the New Testament real quick this morning. In the book of Matthew in chapter 1, he gives a genealogy of Jesus. And there's 4 women mentioned there, one of which is our main person today, which is Ruth. So stay tuned. She is a wonderful example for all of us, and I hope when you're done today, you see the beauty of her story and how it applies to each of us. Okay, so for those of you who know me from the actual class, every one of you would unanimously agree that I love the whiteboard and I love my magic markers. So I want to take a quick look at the who, where, when, what, why on the whiteboard this morning. The who is that it was traditionally viewed as being written by Samuel, but we're going to see a little more information on that in just a few minutes, so I'll hold that for the moment. Secondly, the story is set mostly in Bethlehem, Judah, and also some period of time in the country of Moab. When, during the period of the Judges, it says in the very first chapter in the first verse, but approximately 1150 BC. And what exactly is this? It's the story of Ruth and a gentleman named Boaz who happened to be ancestors of David and eventually ancestors of Jesus. And the why we'll leave until the end of class. Okay, so if you didn't think you got your money's worth with the whiteboard, now we're going to look at something a little more formal. Look, if you will, at the top of the page at the Info What column, and also just keep your eyes on these pictures as we go through. I'm not going to go in great detail on this slide. You've got it to look at later at your leisure. But I do want to mention a couple things, but as I do, just kind of be looking at the pictures because they're very representative of the story we're going to tell today. The first thing was the discussion of whether or not Samuel is the author of the book. And long story short, the commentators think that it was probably somebody after Samuel because Samuel actually dies before David becomes king. And it's pretty clear, and we'll see that at the very end of today's lesson, that the person writing this was doing it in order to tie David, then the king, back to Ruth. The second item down in that same column says something to the effect that this story is very much in contrast to the stories that we heard in Judges. Judges, we heard story after story of dark and disobedience and bad things happening and having to go through distress in order to be delivered. Today we're going to see something much lighter and much better. Also, we're going to find that Ruth is from the country of Moab. And if you recall, in Deuteronomy, they talk about the people of Moab in a very negative fashion. In fact, they say nobody from Moab will ever enter the temple for 10 generations. So Moab is not a very popular place, and people from that location were not considered very highly. So stay tuned and watch what happens with Ruth. And finally, in that fourth cell down on that same column, it says the book of Ruth is one of two Bible books named after women. The other one is Esther. So that's significant because now we have a complete and total book named after a woman. And also, we'll note that the author reminds the reader that Ruth is a foreigner from a despised people at least 8 different times. Okay, so here's just a quick picture of Moab, which is down there just due east of the Salt Sea, and then Bethlehem, which is a city just to the northwest corner of the top of the Salt Sea. And before we begin this morning, just one last look at the timeline. And this is the same timeline we looked at in the book of Judges. I certainly don't expect you guys to be looking at this during the class, but it's good information to have, and it's really just an attempt to show you, relatively speaking, where Ruth falls in the timeline between Judges and the book of Samuel. And you can see there, at least the guess by commentators is that she was sometime around 1140 BC in this story, and that would have put her very likely in the time period of Gideon the judge that we just studied in the last couple of weeks. Okay, so we've gone through all our slides now. We got all the obligatory information out of the way, but I hope that that'll come in as we go through the 4 chapters this morning, and you'll see things in a little bit different perspective because of what we've covered thus far. So let's take a quick look at chapter 1 and kind of get an idea more about the story of Ruth, because it is, again, an incredibly uplifting and a beautiful story. So it says in the very first chapter, in the very first verse, it says, In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. So we've got this guy and his wife, and it turns out the gentleman's name is Elimelech, and he has a wife named Naomi. They're a good Jewish family from Judah, but there's a famine on, and this is a peacetime with Moab, like we mentioned earlier. So they decide to go to Moab, where there's more access to food and more plentiful things going on. So they go, and when they go, Elimelech, they're in the country of Moab, dies. And while he's there, he has 2 sons that go with him too, a guy named Mahlon and Chilion. And they marry 2 Moabite women. You know, they're there now, and they've been there, it says, for a period of about 10 years. And so they're there, and they marry the women that are available to them. So before 10 years is completed, both Mahlon and Chilion die as well. So Naomi, the wife of Elimelech, is left with 2 daughters-in-law, one of which is named Orpah, and the other which is named Ruth, and that's our story today. Now, at the end of the 10 years, Naomi gets some news that, hey, things are better in Bethlehem, come on back home. So she's got, property and home back in Bethlehem. So she says, girls, I'm moving away. I'm going back to where I came from. And so she packs up everything to go. When she does, she says to the 2 daughters-in-law, says, listen, you have been wonderful to me, but both my sons have died. You girls need to go back to your mama's house and start all over. And if you can, find you some husbands here in Moab, back with your gods and your people. I release you. You go back where you're from. Now, they both cried. They loved her mother-in-law. They both had spent and had really positive interactions with her. But one of them said, well, you know what? I think I will go back. So Orpah goes on back home to her mother. But Ruth, the other daughter, daughter-in-law, said, hey, Naomi said, I love you dearly, said, I am not leaving you no matter what. And so we get down to about verse 16. Ruth says, but Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. So these are the lines you traditionally relate to Ruth. You hear, where you go, I'll go, and thus the beginning of today's lesson, whenever we had a really excellent singer and a really marginal accompaniment there. But the reason when we played that in the beginning was I wanted you guys to hear that song in your head this week. Where you go, I'll go. Where you stay, I'll stay. And that's Ruth's story to her mother-in-law today. So Ruth says, hey, I'm staying, and they go back to Bethlehem together. And when they get back to Bethlehem, Naomi, like I said, already has a home. She's only been gone 10 years. And she also has some community of other women. The other women of Bethlehem greet her when she comes back, and they're glad to see her back. And she says, don't call me Naomi, she told them. Said, call me Mara. Now Naomi meant pleasant, and Mara meant bitter. So hold that thought for a second. It says, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. So Naomi feels like she went away with both her husband and 2 sons, and eventually got 2 daughter-in-laws, and now she's back in just her and Ruth. But she's very thankful to have Ruth, and you're going to see that throughout the rest of the lesson today. And the very last verse of chapter 1 says, so Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. Now, I said when we were looking at a couple of those things earlier, look at the pictures, the barley harvest and the wheat harvest. In fact, I think the very first slide today, where they had the music playing at the top, the picture at the bottom was of sheaves of barley. So you're going to see this throughout the rest of the lesson, and chapters 2 through 4 will give you a much better picture of what I'm talking about. So stay tuned, it's coming. Chapter 2 begins with both Naomi and Ruth now in Bethlehem, but with no job and with no income and with no real prospect for taking care of themselves. And we said just a moment ago in chapter 1 that it was the beginning of the barley harvest. So we find now Ruth, we've already seen as an incredibly loyal young woman. We find her also to be a very incredibly industrious and smart young lady. So she tells her mother-in-law, hey, it's the beginning of the barley harvest. Let me go into the fields and find somebody that'll let me go behind them and glean and pick up the scraps off the ground. That'll give us some food to begin with until we can find a better situation. So she goes to the very first place she finds, and it turns out to be the field of a gentleman named Boaz. Now, Boaz is actually a kinsman of Elimelech that had been Naomi's husband. And so she goes there, and the first thing she sees, or first thing he sees that morning when he shows up, he says to his foreman of the group of men that were working in the field, and the foreman over the group of ladies that were following behind, he said, who is that lady out there in the field in the back that I don't know her? What is she doing? And the foreman says, well, that's Naomi's daughter-in-law. That's the Moabitess that came home with Naomi to try to help her along the way. Now, Boaz is impressed by this. He's heard good things, and he realizes that Ruth has had absolutely no legal or even possibly moral obligation to come and take care of Naomi. But here she is in the morning out in the hot sun in the field, working behind people, picking up scraps off the ground to try to feed her mother-in-law. So Boaz is very inclined to help her. He goes to her and says, listen, I know who you are. I know your mother-in-law. How about this? I'm going to let you follow. When my guys cut the barley down and the women come along behind it and tie it up in sheaves, you come behind them and you pick up whatever you find and it's yours. Don't worry about it. It says, furthermore, I'm going to make sure that the men don't bother you in any way. And if you need water or you need anything else, you come with the women that were working there with the men and said, you just help yourself. So Boaz has said, hey, I respect what you're doing and I respect who you're doing it for. You're welcome here all the time. He feeds her lunch even that day. And I think he says at the end of the day, something to the effect says, you just keep coming here all you want to. So Boaz is impressed by Ruth, and Ruth obviously is incredibly thankful. She says to him something to the effect, why have you found such favor, or why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner? And he says back to her, I've been told all about what you've done for your mother-in-law, how you left your father and mother in your homeland and came to live with the people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. So again, Boaz is impressed. So she takes that day and gleans, it says, an ephah Well, that turns out to be 3/5 of a bushel of grain. So she goes home with a big bunch of grain that night. Day one, and sees Naomi. Now, Naomi does not know what kind of success she's had or not, so she meets her at the door, and obviously when she sees the big bag of barley coming in, she's very, very happy. And Naomi says to her, where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. And then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz. Now to this, Naomi knows who Boaz is, so she's rather pleased, and she's going to go on and say something to that effect. She said, he has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. She added, that man is our close relative. He is one of our kinsman redeemers. So he was kin to Elimelech. Not the closest blood kin, but this turns out later in the story to be the second closest blood kin. And as such, he had some opportunity and responsibility toward Naomi and her well-being. And so as this story unfolds, you'll see that play out dramatically to the benefit of all of them, both Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz. And the very last thing in chapter 2, it says in verse 21, says, so Ruth stayed close to the servant girls of Boaz, this is after he told her to come back, to glean until the barley and wheat harvest were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. So she spent the period of the barley harvest working in the fields of Boaz every single day until she had collected quite a bit for her mother-in-law. Okay, as chapter 3 begins, we find Naomi now thinking about the possibility of a matchmaking between Boaz and Ruth. Now, they may not have seen it yet, but she sure did. And so she tells Ruth, hey, the harvest season is done, and it's now time for the men to go to the threshing floor and spend a couple of days threshing the wheat and the barley, and also winnowing it and getting ready to store it for the wintertime. So let me explain that, exactly what that process entailed, to give you some more imagery that I think helps with the storyline. Basically, the men came through the field and cut the wheat. The women came behind them and they bound it into sheaves, but then they took those sheaves and took them to a barn or whatever storage area in order to be processed beyond that to be used. And part of that processing was at the end of the season, the men would all gather at a place called the threshing floor, where they would put these sheaves on the ground and either have a cow or an ox or even a cart run over them until they had pulverized everything, and all that was left was the grain and the chaff and the straw that went with it. And they would then take that and take a winnowing fork, like a pitchfork almost, and throw that stuff up in the air, let the wind blow it out, and all that grain would settle back down on the floor where they could then bag it, store it for the year. Now, because this was a big deal, and they had a collection of all his men that were working for him and him doing this process at the end, they spent a couple of days there. And so they would spend the night at the threshing floor, and they would also, the owner, Boaz, would be there because he wanted to make sure everything was done with propriety, that he didn't lose any grain, that nobody was taking or moving or whatever. So he's watching his stuff. Now, Naomi knows that Boaz and his group of men are going to be on the threshing floor for the next couple of days. And she tells Ruth, hey, Ruth, why don't you put on your finest dress and your best perfume and go down there tonight to the threshing floor. Now, don't let Boaz see you, but whenever he's eaten and he's drank and he lays down for the night, go lay yourself at his feet and see what happens from there. So she takes her mother-in-law's advice, and she does just that. Boaz wakes up in the middle of the night and finds somebody at his feet, and I'm sure he's very startled, as any of us would be. And he says, in about verse 9, says, who are you, he asked. And I am your servant Ruth, she said. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman redeemer. Now, I've read this several times, and it never, ever had gotten this. It went right over my head, so let me try to hopefully explain it in a way that will make better sense. When she says, spread your garment over me, she's saying, in Hebrew culture, I want you to consider me for marriage. And I guess the connotation is, if you're going to put your garment over me and we're going to be under it together, then we're going to get married. So there's more to this than just I'm cold and I need a blanket. She's saying, you're my kinsman redeemer. You're Abimelech's second closest kin. Consider marrying me. Now he's flattered to no end. He says on there, says, you've not run after the younger men or the rich or the poor, said, and now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you what you ask. All my fellow townsmen know that you are a woman of noble character. Now the only problem at all was he was not the closest kin, so there was another person in between him that could stand up and claim Ruth as a wife if he chose to do so. So Boaz says, in the morning, I'll get up and I'll have a conversation with this other gentleman and see where he stands, and I'll get back to you. Now he wakes up in the morning, and I honestly think he feels protective and also very much a part now of her life. And he says to her, says, you get up this morning before anybody realizes it's not good for a woman to have been on the threshing floor. I think he's just looking out for her reputation. He says something, said, so she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before anyone could recognize, or excuse me, before anyone could be recognized. And he said, don't let it be known that a woman came to the threshing floor. Again, Boaz, I think, just looking out for her. He then loads her up with 6 measures of wheat or barley, and she goes home to Naomi. And Naomi, was the matchmaker all along, tickled to see her come home with a big a big bunch of grain to take in, but also wants to know how it went last night. So Ruth tells her how things went, and Naomi says, okay. So he's got to go talk to this other gentleman. In the last verse, he says, wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens. For the man will not rest until the matter is settled today. She's telling Ruth, Boaz is real interested. Let's just wait one more day and we're going to find out what the answer is going to be. In chapter 4, Boaz, very interested now in Ruth and the idea that she would indeed be interested in him as a husband, now goes and tries to make sure that he can make this happen. And so he goes to the gentleman who is the kinsman redeemer, and he tries to see what he's interested in doing or not doing. Meanwhile, Boaz went to the town gate and sat there, and when the kinsman redeemer he had mentioned came along, Boaz said, come over here, my friend, and sit down. So Boaz talks to this gentleman. He also takes 10 elders of Bethlehem to make sure that they're going to stamp this thing as legal and up front and make sure there's no missing information or anything that anybody thinks is out of the way. He talks to this gentleman. He says, you realize Naomi is back in town. She's been gone 10 years and her husband died. She needs somebody to buy her property. And the closest kin person would be the one who's legally in the Hebrew culture, the one obligated to do so, or at least to have first right to do so. So the kinsman redeemer says, yeah, that would be great. I think I would like to expand my property and I'd be glad to buy it from her. So Boaz goes on and says, well, by the way, now if you do that, realize that she came here with not just her, but her daughter-in-law Ruth. So if you buy this land, you're also obligated to take Ruth as a wife. Now the kinsman redeemer said, I don't think I'm interested if that's going to be the case, because it would possibly mess up my inheritance for my own children and my own estate. If I have an heir from Ruth and it turns out to be the only living heir when I die, then my estate can be pulled in under that estate and I would lose my name in the Hebrew land records, if you will. So he decides it's a little too messy for him to have to marry Ruth if he's going to require the land. Boaz is thrilled. So Boaz then goes to the city elders and makes his plan known real quick. It says, Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Kilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabitess, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the property, maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among the family or from the town records. Today you are witnesses. And so the town elders, they stamp their approval and they say something to the effect that just like Rachel and Leah were wonderful wives to Jacob, and obviously that meant they were the mothers of the 12 tribes of Israel, said, as blessed as those people were, may this woman Ruth bless you, Boaz, and your family for time to come. Now, the writer of the book of Ruth takes that and uses that same idea for the purpose that he was writing, which was to tie the person who was king during the time he's writing, which is David, we'll see that in a couple of weeks, back to the story of Ruth and Boaz, and ultimately back to Judah. So in the last dozen or so verses, starting in verse 13, I believe, there's a genealogy given now, right beyond this story, from Perez, who was the son of Judah, down to David, who's the king at the current time of the writer. Now, this is 100 years after the story of Ruth, but the guy who's writing this is sitting underneath King David and writing this story about Ruth. So as we end today, Boaz has married Ruth and has fulfilled his role as kinsman redeemer, and has taken Ruth and Naomi from a very bad and dismal and non-hopeful situation to a place now where Ruth is married. Naomi is blessed now to have family and opportunity and people to take care of her. Ruth and Boaz have a child named Obed, and Obed is considered Naomi's grandbaby, so Naomi's over the top thrilled. Everything is coming up great for her. And notice now, like say in this genealogy, that Obed, at the very last couple of verses, is the father of Jesse, who's the father of King David. And I'll finish up in just a moment with just some final thoughts, but this is the story of Ruth, how a Moabitess from a really bad, despised area is now the great-grandmother of the King David that's sitting at the time of the writer. Okay, so as we finish today, we've got a couple of things you just want to think about for the week to come. 3 points I'd like to leave you with. One was Naomi and Ruth have come from a place of despair and bad situation to a place of hope. And they did that because of a couple of things, Ruth's character and Boaz's character, and them being consistently obedient to God. So Naomi ends up going from losing a husband and 2 sons and coming home and telling the ladies of her home community, I'm bitter and God has treated me in a way that's made me bitter, to ends up with a family and a grandson. And the grandson, again, is going to be in the lineage of David, the king, just a couple of generations later. So Naomi becomes a name that is tied to not but just David, but also Jesus, our Messiah. So she's gone from rags to riches in any context you put it in. Likewise, the author, I think, is trying to tell us, or at least the commentator suggests, that Israel has gone from a pretty rough period of the judges that we just studied over the last 5 weeks, where they had just time after time of disobedience and doing bad things and ending up being oppressed and beat upon pretty badly before they get their attention and come back. The author is trying to say that just like Naomi came out of a bad situation to something good, Israel has come out of a bad situation into something good, which is the kingship, and specifically the kingship of David. And thus the last 10 verses or so talking about the genealogy of David going back up to the line of Judah. So that's the first point that I'd like to make. The second point I'd like to make is, we were talking about Ruth here today, a lady who's a widow, first in a patriarchal society. We talked about last week, she didn't have a whole lot of rights going on outside of the Hebrew faith. She's from Moab, which is a despised country. The Israelites despised them because whenever they first came through from Egypt, Moab did not help them, and God says, don't let the Moabites for 10 generations anywhere near the tabernacle. So Ruth's coming from a really tough background. She got zero political skills or background or any kind of somebody backing her. Instead, she's had little or nothing. But yet, today you'll see that because of one thing and one thing only, Ruth goes from rags to riches as well. Now, Ruth is a woman of high character. We've seen that. She's industrious. She's loyal. She's a wonderful person. Boaz is impressed with her. Like I say, she does a lot of good things that she does in herself. But the thing that makes the difference is, back in the original verses, is where you go, I'll go, where you stay, I'll stay. It goes on to say, said, your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Ruth chooses God, and because she chooses God, and because of her obedience, she becomes a blessing not only to Naomi and to Boaz, but to generations thereafter, all the way down to you and to me today. Because of Ruth's obedience and her choice to choose God over everything else, you and I now see this story in a very different light. Now, again, the writer of this story, living in the time of David, didn't necessarily have any concept of Jesus. He knew a Messiah was coming, but he had no idea when or where. You and I see it through a very different perspective. We see it, and we see Jesus in this lineage, and you can see the incredible importance of Ruth's obedience and Ruth's choices to serve God. And the final thing today, the number 3 point, it says, like Ruth, I want to kind of get in your mind, if you've got zero political strengths, zero money, you're coming from a bad place, you're coming from a place of sin, you're coming from all these bad situations and circumstances, you and I both, thank the Lord, because of Jesus, can be just like Ruth. And we can choose. And we can choose, I think Moses said something like, choose life and prosperity, or you can choose death and destruction. You and I can do just like Ruth and choose in our obedience to follow God. Your God will be my God, she said. So I say to you and to me and to everybody listening today, if you've got any decisions to make them for God, because you can see the outcome of obedience and the outcome of loyalty and a chaste living. She is a wonderful person, and thus we have one of 2 women in the Bible, and it's been a pleasure to teach and to talk about Ruth, because we don't have enough of these stories. Unlike Judges, this one has been very positive, very upbuilding, and I hope it builds you up this week as you go forward as well. Thank you again for listening. We continue to do this during the coronavirus era. My hope is very soon we'll be back in the classroom. We'll just take it a day at a time. Until then, I'm going to try to plan on putting something together, starting with 1 Samuel next week. And given the detail of that book, it'll probably slow down and we'll only do a couple of chapters at a time. But we'll do what God gives us, and we'll keep moving forward, because the one thing for certain during this time is that staying in the Word is a great thing for every one of us. God bless you, God bless your family, and I hope you have a wonderful week.